The mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, obscuring the rows of weathered headstones. Among them, a solitary figure moved with practiced precision. The gravedigger, shoulders hunched against the evening chill. He paused, leaning on his shovel, watching a nurse in white kneeling before the unmarked graves, lighting candles one by one. Her ritual seemed sacred, personal. Each flame illuminated tears on her face, each nameless stone receiving her tender care. Why would someone mourn so deeply for the unknown? The question burned in his mind as the candles flickered, secrets dancing in their light. Don't forget to subscribe to hear what happens when the gravedigger finally approaches the mysterious nurse. For 30 years, Thomas Mercer had been the gravedigger at Oakwood Cemetery, his calloused hands having carved final resting places for generations of the town's departed. The cemetery was more home to him than the small cottage at its edge where he lived alone. His wife Sarah had passed 15 winters ago, and their only son had moved across the country, calls becoming less frequent with each passing year. Thomas carried his grief like the tools of his trade, heavy, familiar, necessary. The loss of Sarah had hollowed him, leaving a void he filled with meticulous work and solitude. He took pride in his precision, in the perfect rectangles he cut into the earth, and knowing every inch of the hallowed ground he tended. The townspeople nodded respectfully when they saw him, but few engaged beyond pleasantries. He was a reminder of mortality they preferred to avoid. His simple desire was to honor the dead properly, to ensure no one was forgotten. This included the occupants of the cemetery's north corner, the unmarked graves of those who had died at the county hospital with no family to claim them. Thomas had always maintained these plots with the same care as any other, though no one ever visited them, until she appeared. The nurse's nightly ritual had continued for a week now. Thomas had finally resolved to approach her, to understand the connection between this young woman and the forgotten souls. As he crossed the misty grounds toward her kneeling figure, the cemetery caretaker, Mr. Blackwood, intercepted him. "Leave her be, Mercer," Blackwood called loudly enough for the nurse to hear. "Don't you have graves to dig rather than harassing visitors?" The nurse glanced up, her candle lighting momentarily interrupted. "I merely wanted to," Thomas began. "We all know what you're after," Blackwood cut in with a dismissive wave. "Always poking around in matters that don't concern you. These hospital cases are administrative business, not yours." Thomas felt heat rise to his face as the nurse watched their exchange. Several mourners visiting nearby plots turned to stare. "The dead deserve names," Thomas said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the evening breeze. Blackwood laughed coldly. "And who appointed you their spokesman? Stick to digging, old man." The nurse's eyes met Thomas's across the distance, something in them speaking of shared understanding, and perhaps shared secrets. Thomas retreated to his cottage that night, Blackwood's mockery still ringing in his ears. Sleep eluded him as he stared at the ceiling, the nurse's sorrowful eyes haunting his thoughts. When dawn broke, he returned to his duties with renewed determination. He was carefully trimming the grass around a family plot when Blackwood approached, flanked by 2 cemetery board members in expensive suits. "Mercer," Blackwood called, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "These gentlemen have concerns about your work." Thomas straightened, wiping soil from his hands. "My work has never been questioned before." "Well, it's being questioned now," Blackwood smirked. "The board feels your obsession with the north corner is inappropriate. You've been spending excessive time there, neglecting your primary responsibilities." "I maintain all areas equally," Thomas replied, aware of how the board members scrutinized him. "And yet Mrs. Henderson complained her husband's plot was overgrown last week," Blackwood countered. "Perhaps at your age, the workload is becoming too much." The implication stung. Thomas had never missed a detail in 30 years of service. "I can handle my duties," he said quietly. "We'll be watching closely," one board member added before they walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone, diminished in the morning light. The following afternoon, Thomas discovered someone had removed the small stone markers he'd placed at each unnamed grave, simple river rocks with dates carved by his own hand. Though not official headstones, they had been his private tribute to the forgotten. As he knelt, searching through the tall grass, Blackwood appeared with the nurse in tow. Her face was pale, eyes downcast. "Ah, looking for these?" Blackwood held up a burlap sack that clinked with stones. "Unauthorized markers are against cemetery policy. Nurse Bennett here has filed a formal complaint about your interference with hospital cases." Thomas looked at the nurse, Bennett, in disbelief. "Is this true?" She wouldn't meet his eyes. "I just mentioned that someone had placed stones. She found it disturbing." Blackwood interrupted. "Miss Dua, this is your final warning, Mercer. Stick to digging graves, not playing detective with the dead. The nurse glanced up briefly, something like apology in her expression, before Blackwood led her away. Thomas remained kneeling in the grass, the emptiness of the unmarked graves mirroring the hollow feeling in his chest. The third blow came during a burial service the next day. Thomas stood at a respectful distance as mourners gathered around a fresh grave. Blackwood conducted the ceremony with practiced solemnity, but when it concluded, he beckoned Thomas forward in front of the departing family. "Mr. Mercer will now complete the interment," Blackwood announced, then added in a stage whisper to the deceased son, "though I'd advise checking the plot tomorrow. He's been distracted lately, obsessing over those nameless hospital graves. Between us, the board is considering his replacement." The family members exchanged uncomfortable glances as Thomas approached, shame burning his face. He gripped his shovel with whitened knuckles, 30 years of dignity stripped away in a moment. That evening, alone in his cottage, Thomas opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a leather-bound journal. Inside were meticulous records spanning decades, names, dates, details of every burial at Oakwood, including notes on the hospital cases that official records omitted. His neat handwriting filled page after page, alongside newspaper clippings, hospital records he'd carefully collected, and correspondence with former hospital staff. Thomas had been more than a gravedigger. Before Sarah's illness had brought him back to town, he'd been an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, with a talent for uncovering buried truths. He ran his finger down a list of dates that corresponded with the unmarked graves, then paused at a familiar name, Bennett. From the window of his estate overlooking Oakwood, Mayor Caldwell lowered his binoculars. He'd been watching the cemetery drama unfold for days. "Interesting," he murmured, reaching for his phone. "Tell Blackwood I need those hospital records." Immediately, Thomas Mercer sat at his desk, the leather-bound journal open before him, its pages illuminated by the warm glow of his desk lamp. The name Bennett seemed to leap from the page, triggering something in his memory. He flipped back through earlier entries until he found what he was looking for, a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago about a young nurse who had raised concerns about unusual deaths at Oakwood Memorial Hospital. The nurse's name was Elizabeth Bennett. Thomas leaned back in his chair, journalist instincts awakening after years of dormancy. The pieces were beginning to align. The nameless graves, Blackwood's aggressive defensiveness, and now this nurse with a familiar surname who appeared distressed by his interest in the unmarked plots. "Time to dust off the old toolkit," he murmured, reaching for a fresh notebook. By dawn, Thomas had compiled a timeline connecting hospital deaths, unmarked burials, and Blackwood's tenure as cemetery director. The pattern was troubling. The number of anonymous burials had increased dramatically after Blackwood took over, coinciding with Mayor Caldwell's election and the hospital's financial restructuring. Thomas dressed carefully that morning, not in his gravedigger's attire, but in a pressed shirt and slacks he rarely wore. He tucked his old press credentials into his pocket, expired but still impressive looking, and headed not to the cemetery but to the Oakwood Herald's archives. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," said Marge Wilson, the Herald's longtime archivist. "Thomas Mercer, as I live and breathe. Thought you'd given up the scribbling life for good." "Just digging a different kind of hole these days, Marge," he replied with a smile. "Need to look at some back issues, hospital board meetings, obituaries, anything about unidentified patients from the last decade." Marge raised an eyebrow but asked no questions as she led him to the microfilm readers. "Still got that nose for trouble, I see." 4 hours, Thomas scrolled through records, taking meticulous notes. What emerged was disturbing, a pattern of John Doe and Jane Doe deaths at the hospital, many occurring shortly after budget cuts to indigent care programs. The official causes varied: heart failure, pneumonia, unspecified illness, but the timing was suspicious. More troubling was what he found in the board meeting minutes. Blackwood had been appointed cemetery director through Mayor Caldwell's direct intervention, bypassing normal procedures. Prior to that, he worked at a private medical waste disposal company that contracted with the hospital. Thomas was so engrossed in his research that he didn't notice the man watching him from across the archive room until he stood to leave. The observer quickly averted his gaze, but Thomas recognized him as one of the mayor's aides. That afternoon, Thomas made his way to the hospital, press credentials displayed prominently. At the nurse's station, he asked for Nurse Bennett with the confidence of someone conducting official business. "She's in the East Wing," said a young nurse, barely glancing up. Thomas found Elizabeth Bennett changing in four-bag in a quiet room. She startled when she saw him. "Mr. Mercer, what are you doing here?" "I think we need to talk, Ms. Bennett," he said quietly, "about those unmarked graves and why they trouble you so much." Her hands trembled slightly. Not here. I was a journalist before I was a gravedigger, Thomas said, keeping his voice low. Chicago Tribune. I know when something's being buried, and I don't mean just bodies. Elizabeth glanced nervously down the hall. Meet me at Riverside Park after my shift. 6 o'clock. Thomas nodded and left, feeling the weight of watchful eyes as he exited the hospital. He spent the intervening hours at the public library, researching property records for the cemetery and hospital. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. Both properties had been rezoned under Caldwell's administration, with parcels of the cemetery land quietly transferred to a development company registered to a shell corporation. At 6, Thomas sat on a bench overlooking the river, watching ducks glide across the water's surface. Elizabeth arrived 15 minutes late, still in scrubs but with a cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders. My mother was a nurse at Oakwood, she began without preamble, sitting beside him. Elizabeth Bennett Sr., the woman you read about 15 years ago. Thomas nodded. She raised concerns about patient deaths. She believed indigent patients were being neglected, deliberately. Not active euthanasia, but selective care. Treatments delayed, pain management inadequate. Elizabeth's voice cracked. She kept records. After she went public, she was discredited, labeled unstable. 6 months later, she died in a car accident. I'm sorry, Thomas said softly. I became a nurse to continue her work. I've been documenting everything. Patients who arrive without identification, who die without family, who disappear into those graves you've been marking. She pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. It's all here. Dates, medical records, patterns of care. But I needed proof of what happens after they die. That's where I come in, Thomas realized. The cemetery records. Elizabeth nodded. When I saw you placing those markers, I thought maybe, but then Blackwood made me file that complaint. He threatened my job. Thomas took the flash drive. Blackwood's connected to Mayor Caldwell. They've been rezoning cemetery land for development. I think the unmarked graves are part of it. Fewer identified remains means fewer legal obstacles to moving or building over them. It's worse than that, Elizabeth whispered. Some of those patients shouldn't have died at all. I believe they're accelerating deaths of unidentified patients to clear beds and reduce costs. The hospital gets paid either way, but long-term care for indigent patients drains resources. Thomas felt a chill. That's murder. It's systematic neglect with plausible deniability, she corrected. Almost impossible to prove without. Wigs snapped behind them. They turned to see a man in a dark coat quickly walking away. We're being watched, Thomas said. We need to move carefully. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the cemetery to find Blackwood waiting by the maintenance shed, face thunderous. You're fired, Mercer. Effective immediately. The board met last night in emergency session. Thomas maintained a calm exterior despite his racing heart. On what grounds? Insubordination. Harassment of hospital staff. Take your pick. Blackwood thrust an envelope at him. Your final pay. Clear out your cottage by the end of the week. Thomas accepted the envelope. Interesting timing. Right after I started asking questions about the hospital deaths and those land transfers to Caldwell Development Partners. Blackwood's face paled slightly. What are you talking about? I may dig graves now, but I spent 20 years digging up truths for the Tribune, Thomas said, his voice steady. I know about the rezoning, the shell companies, the pattern of deaths. I know Elizabeth Bennett's mother died after raising similar concerns. You're delusional, Blackwood hissed, but his eyes darted nervously. Then you won't mind if I share my findings with the State Attorney General's office. I've already uploaded everything to secure servers, Elizabeth's records, my cemetery documentation, the property transfers. One call from me, and it all goes public. It was a bluff. He hadn't had time to secure the evidence yet. But Blackwood didn't know that. You're making a serious mistake, Blackwood said, voice low with threat. No, you made the mistake, Thomas replied. You thought a gravedigger wouldn't notice patterns. You thought no one cared about the nameless dead. You were wrong. As they stood in tense silence, a black town car pulled up to the cemetery gates. The back window lowered, revealing Mayor Caldwell. Everything all right, gentlemen? He called pleasantly. Blackwood turned. Just handling a personnel matter, sir. Mr. Mercer, Caldwell nodded. I heard about your termination. Unfortunate. My office will be reviewing all cemetery operations in light of recent concerns. Perhaps we should postpone any staffing changes until the review is complete. Thomas met Caldwell's gaze, understanding the subtle message. The mayor was distancing himself, protecting his own interests. That seems prudent, Thomas agreed. Blackwood sputtered in protest, but Caldwell raised a hand. It's decided. Mr. Mercer stays until our review concludes. Good day, gentlemen. As the car pulled away, Thomas realized the mayor was playing both sides, offering protection while assessing which way the wind was blowing. It wasn't justice, but it was time to secure the evidence and bring the truth to light. This isn't over, Blackwood muttered. No, Thomas agreed. It's just beginning. That night, as Thomas carefully organized his evidence, he wondered about all the viewers following his story. Where were they watching from? What unmarked graves existed in their own communities? The thought strengthened his resolve. Some stories needed to be told, no matter how deeply they were buried. The next morning, Thomas found his cottage door ajar. Inside, his files were scattered, computer missing. On the kitchen table lay a single photograph, himself and Elizabeth at the graves, with a note. Accident happened to those who dig too deep. Remember your daughter's fate. Thomas stared at the photograph, his hands trembling with rage rather than fear. They had crossed a line by threatening his daughter. He carefully gathered what remained of his evidence, backup notes he'd hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom, and made a decision. It was time to accelerate his plan. He called Elizabeth first. I need you to stay at your friend's place for a few days. Dad, what's happening? Her voice carried the weight of concern. Just precautionary. I'm close to something big at Oakwood. These people, they don't want the truth coming out. After ensuring Elizabeth's safety, Thomas drove to Nurse Bennett's modest apartment. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at his disheveled appearance. They broke into my home, he explained. Took my files, my computer. She ushered him inside, checking the hallway before closing the door. I was afraid this would happen. My mother experienced the same before her accident. We need to move now, Thomas said. I have copies of the death records, but we need more. The hospital administration files linking Blackwood to Caldwell Development. Sarah nodded grimly. I can get us into the hospital records room tonight. I'm on the late shift. It's dangerous, Thomas warned. My mother died trying to expose this, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I won't let them bury the truth with her. That evening, Thomas parked his truck 3 blocks from Oakwood Memorial Hospital. The plan was simple but perilous. Sarah would use her access card to enter the administrative wing while Thomas created a distraction in the emergency department. At precisely 11:30 p.m., Thomas stumbled into the ER, clutching his chest and collapsing dramatically into a chair. As nurses rushed to his aid, Sarah slipped away from her station, making her way to the 4th floor. Possible cardiac event, a young doctor announced, leading Thomas to an examination room. He felt a pang of guilt for the deception but reminded himself of the stakes. Dozens of unexplained deaths, corrupt officials, and threats against his daughter. Meanwhile, Sarah moved swiftly through the dimly lit administrative corridor. Using the master key she'd borrowed from the head nurse's office, she entered the records room. The hospital had digitized most files, but Dr. Blackwood, old-fashioned and paranoid, kept certain sensitive documents in physical form. Sarah located the cabinet labeled Board Meetings Confidential and began photographing documents with her phone. Minutes from closed-door sessions, financial reports showing unusual payments to shell companies, and most damning, a memo from Blackwood to Mayor Caldwell discussing patient management protocols for those occupying beds in the hospital's East Wing, the same wing where most of the mysterious deaths had occurred. The East Wing sat on property that, according to county records, was slated for luxury condominiums once vacated. In the ER, Thomas was running out of time. The doctor had ordered an EKG, which would quickly reveal his deception. I'm feeling much better, Thomas insisted, sitting up. Probably just indigestion. Sir, with your symptoms, we need to rule out. A code blue announcement interrupted them. The doctor apologized and rushed out, leaving Thomas momentarily unattended. He seized the opportunity, slipping out of the examination room and heading toward the service elevator. Sarah had just finished photographing the last document when her phone vibrated. A text from Thomas, coming up. Security on rounds. She quickly returned the files to their proper places and moved toward the door. As she reached for the handle, voices approached from hallway. Old Blackwood, we need to be more careful. The Gravedigger is causing problems. He won't be a problem much longer. The mayor's arranged something. Sarah froze, recognizing the voices of Dr. Reynolds and the hospital's head of security. She retreated behind a tall filing cabinet as the door opened. Just a quick check of the Caldwell files, Reynolds said, moving to a cabinet marked CDP Ventures. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the wall. If they discovered her, everything would be lost. Through the crack between cabinets, she watched Reynolds remove a thick folder and flip through it. The land transfer documents are all here, he confirmed. Once the remaining patients are transitioned, we can proceed with demolition. Transition, the security head chuckled darkly. That's one way to put it. Sarah's blood ran cold. They were openly discussing patient deaths as a means to clear the property. The men finally left, and seconds later, Thomas slipped into the room. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. "Security's doing an unscheduled sweep." They made their way to the service elevator, hearts pounding. As the doors opened on the ground floor, they came face to face with Dr. Blackwood. For a moment, all three stood frozen in shock. "Evening round, Sarah," Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously calm. "And, Mr. Mercer, I wasn't aware you were a patient." "Just leaving," Thomas replied evenly. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I don't think so. Security will want to speak with both of you." He reached for his phone, but Thomas moved quickly, grabbing Blackwood's wrist. "We know everything," Thomas said quietly. "The patient deaths, the land deals, Mayor Caldwell's development plans. It's over, Blackwood." "You have nothing," Blackwood sneered, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Sarah stepped forward. "We have the board meeting minutes, the financial records, the memo about patient management protocols for the East Wing." The color drained from Blackwood's face. "You're going to let us walk out of here," Thomas continued, "or everything goes to the state attorney general tonight." Blackwood's expression hardened. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes beyond me, beyond Caldwell. There are powerful people involved who won't hesitate to." "To what?" Thomas interrupted. "Kill us like the others." "Too late. The evidence is already backed up to secure servers. If anything happens to either of us, it all goes public." It wasn't entirely true. They hadn't had time to secure the evidence yet, but the bluff worked. Blackwood stepped aside. As they walked toward the exit, Blackwood called after them. "This isn't over. You have no idea what forces you're challenging." Outside in the parking lot, Sarah's hands trembled as she showed Thomas the photos she'd taken. "This is it," Thomas said, examining the images. "Proof of the conspiracy." "What now?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked at her, the weight of their discovery heavy between them. "We have two choices. Take this directly to the authorities and hope they're not compromised, or what? Or we go public first, give the evidence to every news outlet in the state. Once it's out there, they can't bury it." Sarah considered this, remembering her mother's fate after trusting the proper channels. "Going public means no turning back," she said quietly. "They'll come after us with everything they have." Thomas nodded, thinking of Elizabeth, of the nameless graves, of all the families who never knew the truth about their loved ones' deaths. "Some truths need to be told," he said, "no matter how deeply they're buried." The choice lay before them, safety or justice, with lives hanging in the balance. Thomas and Sarah chose to go public. Within hours, they had uploaded all the evidence to a secure cloud server and sent encrypted links to every major news outlet in the state, along with the state attorney general's office and the FBI. By dawn, the story had broken nationwide. Breaking: whistleblowers expose fatal patient neglect scheme at Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital. The headlines spread like wildfire. Security footage from the hospital showed Dr. Blackwood and Mayor Caldwell in heated discussions about accelerated patient turnover. Financial records revealed millions in kickbacks. Most damning were the death certificates with falsified causes of death, all signed by Blackwood. 3 days later, Thomas stood at his kitchen window, watching federal agents escort Mayor Caldwell from City Hall in handcuffs. The mayor's face, once smug with power, now sagged with defeat as cameras flashed around him. "They're saying Caldwell's already offering to testify against the development company," Sarah said, joining Thomas at the window. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, but there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before. "Self-preservation was always his specialty," Thomas replied. The investigation moved with surprising speed. Dr. Blackwood attempted to flee the country, but was apprehended at a private airfield. The hospital board members resigned en masse, claiming ignorance of the scheme. The development company's stock plummeted as investors fled. Yet justice remained imperfect. Some of the most powerful players had insulated themselves through layers of shell companies and proxies. The state senator who had championed the zoning changes claimed he was misled and escaped with a censure. Several mid-level hospital administrators took plea deals for reduced sentences. 1 week after the story broke, Thomas and Sarah returned to the cemetery. The nameless graves now bore temporary markers as authorities worked to identify the remains and contact families. A small crowd had gathered, relatives of the deceased, former hospital staff, community members, all holding candles in the fading light. "My mother would have been proud," Sarah said softly, placing flowers on Elizabeth's grave. "She always said the truth finds its way to the surface eventually." Thomas nodded, thinking of his own mother. "I wish we could have saved them." "We couldn't save them," Sarah acknowledged, "but we honored them. That counts for something." As darkness fell, they watched Dr. Blackwood's public statement on Sarah's phone. Gone was the confident administrator, replaced by a haggard man in prison orange. His voice cracked as he confessed to falsifying records and prioritizing financial considerations over patient welfare. His lawyer had negotiated a deal, 20 years instead of life, in exchange for testimony against the development consortium. "He'll never practice medicine again," Thomas said, pocketing the phone. "It's not enough," Sarah replied, "but it's something." The following day, they attended the public hearing where the city council unanimously voted to designate the hospital grounds as a memorial park. The development plans were permanently shelved. As they left City Hall, a woman approached them, the daughter of one of the patients who had died in the East Wing. "My father," she said, voice trembling. "They told us it was heart failure. But it wasn't, was it?" "No," Sarah answered gently. "I'm so sorry." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for the truth. Even when it hurts, it's better than not knowing." Later, standing at the cemetery gates, Thomas and Sarah watched as workers carefully exhumed the remains from the unmarked graves for proper identification and reburial. "What now?" Thomas asked. Sarah looked out at the rolling hills beyond the cemetery, at the hospital in the distance where new management was already implementing reforms. "Now," she said, "we make sure this never happens again." The setting sun cast long shadows across the graves, but for the first time in years, the darkness held no secrets. 6 months later, Thomas settled into his new routine with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The cemetery had transformed, no longer a place of secrets but of healing. Each morning, he tended the grounds with renewed purpose, watching families visit their loved ones with the dignity of knowing the truth. The memorial park where the hospital once stood had become a community gathering place. Thomas often spotted Sarah there during her lunch breaks from her new position at the county medical examiner's office, where she'd been hired to implement new oversight protocols. "Never thought I'd see the day," Thomas remarked one evening as they walked the cemetery paths. "People actually requesting plots near the eastern section now." Sarah smiled. "Amazing what truth can do." The newspaper had called them whistleblowers, heroes even, but Thomas preferred the quiet satisfaction of watching life return to normal, a better normal. As dusk fell, Thomas locked the cemetery gates, breathing deeply of the autumn air. The weight he'd carried for so long had finally lifted. Walking to his truck, he noticed a small envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. Inside was a faded photograph of a young nurse standing beside an elderly doctor he didn't recognize. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, they weren't the first. "Look into Westridge Sanitarium, 1967. Thomas stared at the unfamiliar faces, feeling the familiar tug of a mystery unfolding. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Thomas should investigate this new lead?